The Spokane British Brass Band, where I am fortunate enough to play principal cornet, just recently had its first rehearsal of the season at the time of my filming this, and something really cool happened in rehearsal. The second chair, my co-principal, had two different horns on him, and he tested them both out in rehearsal, and he found them to be very, very different horns, but he wanted to give me one and have me give him my thoughts on it, and he said perhaps do a video on it as well. You know I can't pass up on something like that. So we've got something very special inside this here case today. Let's pop it open. So here is the cornet that my friend is letting me borrow for the next couple weeks, and it is a Manchester Brass professional cornet. This is a really cool instrument, and it is interesting in the way that it plays, in that it is also very different from a lot of the cornets I've played as well. So it's been an interesting adjustment, and there are a lot of interesting features and playability impressions I've got about this instrument that I would like to discuss here and now. In the past, when I've heard about Manchester Brass, I've usually heard about them through or from Austin Custom Brass, who carries a full Manchester line on their website. Manchester Brass as a company is a fairly recent one in terms of the brass industry. It's only been around for about 15 years, if I recall properly, and their instruments are made in Taiwan. This is the case for a number of really well-respected brands now, such as Jupiter and Karl Brass. And indeed, when I look at the features of this horn, which we will discuss in more depth momentarily, I do see some of those Taiwanese influences, the likes of which you would see from either instruments like Karl Brass or other companies who were based in America or the UK or some such thing, but outsourced their production of student model instruments to Taiwan. But important to consider is, again, the fact that this is a professional instrument in some respect. It is not an outsourced student model, it is just that Manchester does all of their manufacturing in Taiwan. So features, right? We'll start with some of the major ones and then we'll go more into depth from there. The biggest things to note about this instrument are things like the shepherd's crook gold brass bell. You'll notice the yellow brass, yellow lacquer configuration of absolutely everything else on the instrument. Brass being a mainly copper and zinc alloy, we see 70% copper makeup through just about all of the instrument, until you get past this yellow brass bell ferrule here, and the color changes to something more gold-like in nature, and gold brass has a higher copper content, usually 80 to 85%, most commonly, I think, 85, and so that's what I'm gonna operate on the assumption of here. The other big specs, the bore at the valve section is a medium-large .460 as affirmed by the ML on the valve casing, and the bell is a fairly small 4 3/4 inch flare with a little bit more bell throat than you would find on a trumpet. There's quite a lot of space here, and it's not as sudden of a flare right at the end as you would get with most trumpets. I'll also make the note on bore size that I did take out the main tuning slide and test both tubes with my calipers, and the bottom tube through which the bore would be smaller if it was a dual bore did not come out to any smaller than the top tube. So this is a standard single bore cornet, perhaps not quite as conical through the first section of the instrument as some true cornet enthusiasts would like it to be, but we'll again touch on more of that later. Some other fun features of the horn incoming: we have fixed first and third slide adjustment, just a standard shunt on the first slide and ring on the third slide. No spring-loaded triggers on this instrument, which some may prefer. There is also a fun feature on the third slide where we have a nice knurled stop screw that is actually on the other side from what you would typically see from most cornets in my experience, and I actually really like that because there's nothing sticking out and liable to get battered on the other side of the third valve slide. I think that's probably the better way to do it, to have it kind of tucked away behind the main bow of the instrument. And on the first slide, we see something interesting that we would usually see on vintage instruments that didn't have first slide shunts, and that is a couple of pull nubs. I honestly do think that's probably a good addition, considering it makes the slide a little bit easier to remove if it's on the way to being stuck. Obviously, if a slide is stuck in earnest, you're not getting it out no matter how much pressure you put on the pull nubs, and you'll sooner break them off and make them come unsoldered from the slide crook than actually get the slide out without proper penetrating oil and proper tools. But nonetheless, for when a slide is moving a little slowly, it is nice to have those pull nubs there. On the main slide, something I didn't mention earlier is that we have a brace here for a little bit more stability. Also noted about the slide, pretty tight tolerances. These Taiwanese makers, they really do make the parts fit together well these days. The manufacturing standards are very high. And it's not that there's any sort of bend in the tubing, obviously. First of all, there's this brace stabilizing it. And second of all, everything is very straight. The slide action is a uniform speed and smoothness throughout its stroke. It's just that these are very tight tolerances, which is good. This main tuning slide is not going to leak anytime soon. This is also quite a nice and sturdy case as well. Still quite lightweight, but really well padded throughout. It's got a folder here, got a couple of different grab handles. That's the slot because I forgot to zip it up. But anyway, if you're old school and you have any hang-ups about Taiwan versus China, you don't see cases like this coming with instruments made actually in China. This is something you see more often with the fairly high manufacturing standards, again, that you have with factories in Taiwan. When I was researching about this instrument for this video, I came across a video by Trent Austin of Austin Custom Brass, where he was demonstrating a range of cornets, and this was one of them, and I skipped to the part of the video about this, where he affirmed some of my early impressions playing this instrument. And it's interesting because this instrument is, a professional level shepherd's crook cornet, but its use case, its optimal use case, is a little bit different than you might expect. As I had found when I tried it briefly at rehearsal and then tried it more extensively at home, Trent Austin mentioned that this was specifically made to be a little bit more bright and nimble and, in a way, jazz-oriented than your typical shepherd's crook cornet, where obviously the main use case would be the British brass band, which Ryan brought this instrument to. I think it's really good for the jazz musician who's ripping over the entire range. I don't know many who use cornet for that purpose, but I think if you do a lot of Roy Hargrove type playing, it would be really effective in that area. It is, I will say, brighter than just about any other cornet I've played in recent memory, so I'm not personally used to brighter than average cornets as someone who seeks fairly dark playing instruments in general. But because I use fairly dark mouthpieces on the cornet, like the Denis Wick 2B that you would have heard in the intro clip, this actually gels relatively well with it. It is still bright for my tastes, but the thing is, my tastes in the practice room here at home are different sometimes from my impulses in rehearsal, where you need your sound to carry a certain way in relation to the players around you. And if I'm playing on a relatively dark cornet, especially in principal chair where I'm supposed to be playing top split and solos and all of that, my sound can get lost a little bit with such a deep, wide-cupped mouthpiece. And so something like this that carries a little better might not be the worst thing in the world, even if it's not my sound specifically. But it's important to harp on the bright point, because anytime I used anything shallower than the Wick 2B, certainly, the Wick 2B was bright enough on this horn for my taste, but anything shallower than that, it really had an edge and a spin to the tone when I pushed it a little bit. And so this ends up being one of the very few true jazz cornets, in my opinion, that I've played. There are others out there that do well for jazz even if they're not marketed as such, but I think this is specifically declared more of the jazz soloist stream than the brass bander's stream, and I'm very much inclined to agree with it. I think it is really flexible and nimble, and has quite a range of tone qualities it can capitalize on, so you can go from relatively dark, as you would hope from a cornet, to very bright indeed, but you can go all the way from sort of the cool tone with a deeper mouthpiece to something really rickety and old school sounding with a shallower one. I'll also note the full range speaks pretty well. I would say it's more nimble in the upper register than quite a lot of cornets I've played, at least to the point of high C or high D. Going much higher than that, I didn't notice it to be exceptional necessarily. Still good, but nothing crazy. and I kind of wore out my chops trying to do it on the Wick, so I tested it on a couple different mouthpieces, and yeah, it is very literal in terms of the mouthpiece you plug into it. It does a lot better in the upper register with a shallower mouthpiece. It is interesting, that's not something I hear discussed often, but it is, in my opinion, very much the case that different horns have different levels of mouthpiece receptiveness. Some are relatively strong up high regardless of what kind of cup you stick on it, and then some, like this, do really well in the upper register if you use a shallower cup, but then don't feel quite as exceptional with a deeper cup. And there is a spectrum on which horns can lie, and I think this is more mouthpiece receptive. The flip side of this, of course, being if I'm using this with the Wick 2B in brass band and the part goes much above a high C, which thankfully usually it doesn't, but in the rare instances where perhaps it would in more complicated pieces, I wouldn't notice it to be as exceptional in that case. Again, because if you pair it with a deeper cup, you lose out on a little bit more of that than some other cornets I've played that have had a more consistently speaking range, I guess, between different mouthpieces. But again, this really is the jazz player's dream, because in the spectrum of mouthpieces that I tried on it, I actually did try something that I've been messing with lately that's deeper than my Denis Wick 2B, and that is a fun little Vennture mouthpiece 3D print that I was sent from a friend of mine, and it is their Bandmaster model, which is actually more similar to the even deeper no-letter Wick mouthpiece. So I have the Bandmaster S650, which is pretty much a Denis Wick 2, but with a lot of optimization done to certain sections of the cup, and especially the throat and backbore, to get it to play with better clarity and better intonation, better upper register and whatnot, than the Denis Wick 2. So it ends up being a mouthpiece with a similar affect, but better tendencies overall, and I certainly like it better than I liked my old Denis Wick 2. But why am I talking about the jazz player's dream if I'm bringing up this big, fat, very traditional British cornet cup for brass band playing? It's because while this instrument doesn't quite turn into a mini flugel with one, the way that, for instance, my Con 28A Constellation cornet does, and yes, believe it or not, this is a cornet, it does turn nice and dark and fluffy, and kind of on the order of, let's say, the Chuck Mangione or studio lead player flugel sound. So obviously not the darkest in existence, but still relatively smoky and fluffy, so that when you play ballads on it, and because of the looser slots you get some really nice jazz inflection out of it, it is a really nice, somewhat brighter flugelhorn-like effect, even if it isn't a dark cornet. And that's the distinction that should be made between that horn and something like my 28A, which does kind of turn into a mini flugelhorn. It gets a little bit tubby, not as agile, and the jazz inflection on it isn't quite the same. So while I personally prefer the sound of the 28A, and I like a flugelhorn tone that is darker than the dark side of the moon, maybe this would actually end up working in a lot of people's favor. If they're not looking for raw darkness, and rather they're looking for smokiness and the ability to, still play in tune in the upper register, not a bad choice. So I guess the point of this video was to answer Ryan's question, would I use this for brass band? And the answer is probably not. It's not a firm no from me necessarily, because I admit, when I'm in the front row and I'm, again, in charge of top splits and solos, and I like the blow of the deep Denis Wick 2B cup, but the others in the front row are playing much shallower mouthpieces and typically tend to project farther forward a little bit easier. Sometimes having an instrument that assists in that kind of quest and detracts from the darkness of my overall sound, it might not be such a bad thing overall. But ultimately, it is hard for me to play my best when my brain is not agreeing with the sound that it's hearing come out of the bell. And as I mentioned, this cornet doesn't really have my sound, and so I end up not really playing my fullest on it. And I think eventually that would catch up to me and put me in a suboptimal headspace mentally while I play, which I've been very liable to over the years, and I am personally doing a lot of work to kind of cure myself of now that I'm very much a career engineer and don't have enough head space, literally speaking, to worry about how I sound or worry about how well I'm performing in music. It is the type of thing that is supposed to be fun for me and nothing else. But again, for the jazz cornet player who does want a brighter sound and does mentally agree with that sound concept a little more, this is a really effective choice. And I think that's a good place to start wrapping up and putting a bow on the package of my thoughts on the Manchester professional cornet. I do think this is a professional instrument. Again, some people have hang-ups about instruments coming out of Taiwan. I've reviewed a number of instruments on the channel that have various Karl brass instruments, my John Packer euphonium. These are really solid instruments on all accounts, and I do believe this does fit the professional's bill. It just depends on which professional you hand it to and what kind of use they're looking to get out of it. For instance, Ryan, my second chair, who owns this instrument and will hopefully get some use out of it, he is much more of a jazz player. He's actually a lead player himself, and I think he will jive with this horn pretty well. I enjoy playing on it, but I don't make the best use of it. I think he might. It's receptive to the different types of mouthpieces you put into it, and while personally it never gets quite dark enough for me and my solo cornet needs, I think it does sound really good in a variety of different settings with a variety of different mouthpieces. It just depends on the impulses of the player. And that's why reviews on this channel are sometimes a little bit fraught and why they're a little bit difficult to conclude logically, because different people have such different experiences with different instruments, and it's so individualized that it's tough to be objective after a certain point. But hopefully this video kind of gave you an insight into my thought process with cornets and how I go about choosing one for different genres, and how this cornet might or might not be for you. With that, I appreciate your time as always. You can find more instrument reviews in the top right corner in the card. But until next time, I'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to support the creation of bigger and better content on the Samuel Plays Brass channel, have your name featured right here, and a whole host of other perks and benefits, then please consider pledging your support at patreon.com/SamuelPlaysBrass. For now, you can find more videos in the end screen cards to my left.